Hello everyone! Today we're going to go over how to draw a cat's face. First we're going to have to go over the realistic proportions of a cat, and then we can try and add some stylization later on. We want to first start by drawing the realistic cat proportions because in order to stylize, we really still need to know the underlying basic proportions that a cat has. But before we start, if you want to see more tutorials like this one, make sure to subscribe to the XPPen channel. You can follow along with my sketch if you want, but if you're going to be drawing a cat yourself, I highly suggest you get a reference alongside your drawing to help get you a more accurate looking sketch. It takes a real long time to fully master drawing a specific object, so unless you've only been drawing cats every time you draw, don't be afraid to pull up a good reference. I mean, for this tutorial, I looked up orange tabby cats so that I could better teach the proportions to you guys. Okay, so whenever you're going to start a drawing or painting, you want to first break down the figure into its largest shapes. So in this case for the cat, we can simply define the head as a nice large circle. And then we can add some triangles for the ears. Then we just want to add some guidelines to divide the face in 4. One thing I want you to notice is how the cat ears are not perfect triangles, and that the circle for the head is just ever so slightly squashed down into an oval. One common issue is that most people will draw their shapes too rigid for an organic structure. You can have rigid shapes, it just has to make sense for what you're drawing. So for example, when you're drawing a table, having a nice sharp rectangle makes sense, but for when you're drawing a realistic cat face, it doesn't really make sense to have a square. When stylizing, however, that's when you can start playing around with how your shape works, but we'll get into that later. Okay, next up are the medium shapes on the face. We have the cat's snout, the cat's cheeks, and the eye sockets. For the cat's cheeks, I like to add these 2 ovals, acting as that extra fluff and shape that part of the face. For the eye sockets, you're just going to want to draw an oval that's been bent at the end, and you really just kind of have to play around with the oval until it looks right. You're also going to want to make sure that the eyes are slightly above that center guideline. Then you're going to want to divide the bottom half of the face further into 3 evenly spaced lines. The first line is where you draw the cat's nose. For now, we can just have a simple triangle to indicate the nose, and we'll define that much more later on in the smaller shape section. On the second line, we're going to define the snout. Draw a line for the mouth, and then draw these 2 L shapes coming from the nose. This will give us the indication of that snout. Finally, we can just add the chin following the original circle, of course with some jagged lines to indicate a fur texture. So adding those medium shapes really helped us break down the larger shapes and really start to tie down the drawing. After this point, hopefully you can really start to identify the features of a cat. Okay, now moving on to the smaller shape section. For the smaller shapes, I start with drawing the eyeballs. Notice how they take up 90% of the eye socket. In fact, you can barely see the whites of the eyes in most cats, and all you can really see are the actual eyeballs. Oh, and by the way, if you notice, I sort of cheated and added these little ovals in as an indicator for the eyebrows in a cat's fur pattern in the medium shape section, but really those probably belong in the smaller shape section. Anyways, we're going to go back to the nose and make it more cat-like. Basically, you start by adding the nostrils as even smaller triangles and then start shaping the nose into a T shape, a bubble letter T shape. As you can see, I'm now adding all the fur details with just little spiky lines to make the face feel furry. I'm not drawing every single hair, but just adding lines here and there to indicate the fur. Plus, it's only a sketch, so a lot of the times doing too much here will mess you up when you start painting with color. Finally, you can add whiskers coming out of the cat's snout. A couple of lines will do the trick. Oh, and before we move on, I want to talk about using the liquify tool. With the liquify tool selected, I can move the lines by dragging them across the page, which helps me just adjust the sketch without having to erase and redraw parts of the cat. Anyway, there were some areas in the face that were slightly unbalanced and asymmetrical, so I used the liquify tool to drag them into place. At this point, with the facial features down, we can start to add the patterns of a cat. And again, for reference, we're looking at an orange tabby cat. So I add slight lines to indicate the direction of the fur first. Then, on an orange tabby cat, they have this pattern on their foreheads, and again, since this is a sketch, I'm keeping it simple and just indicating the actual design. For thicker areas, I add another line to fill out the shape. The lines are still shaky/spiky, but now they actually have a shape instead of just being a line. And there you have it, that's basically all we need to do for a realistic cat face. Now that you have the basic understanding of the facial structure of a realistic cat, we can start to bend the rules and stylize the features how we want to. So for the first stylized sketch, I'm going to be going for an overly cute cat. And to do this, we're going to want to draw in a way that emphasizes cuteness. Now, what do I actually mean by that? Well, one thing to understand is that the key to stylization is actually shapes. Remember how I talked about large, medium, and small shapes while drawing the realistic cat? To stylize, we need to try and experiment with how much we can change those original shapes, those original large, medium, and small shapes, so that the drawing still looks like a cat, but is now much more representational, and not just a copy of a cat we see in real life. To get the cuteness factor we're looking for, all the shapes that I'll be drawing will have a rounder, more soft edge compared to the original shapes. The reason circles are more inviting is because of the lack of hard edges that triangles and squares might have. Those shapes also give off their own unique feeling to the viewer, but that could be a topic of an entirely separate video. If you want a quick crash course on shape language, you can just take a look at the Walt Disney Company Shape Language resource. It's a condensed couple of pages, but it really just gives you the essential on shape language. Okay, back to stylization. As you can see, the head shape is basically a perfect circle, the triangles are now a lot rounder, and the eyes have also become almost perfect circles. I also curved the mouth up to create almost a W shape to emphasize cuteness. For the fur pattern, we still want to follow the same path, but I just didn't emphasize the thick portions of the dark fur and just used lines to insinuate them. And last but not least, I filled the eyeball and added this really bright, satisfying highlight. Boom, now we have a round, cute, stylized cat. Okay, now I just want to try and play around and try and draw a bored / more aloof cat. So this time, instead of using a circle, we're actually going to be starting off with a rounded rectangle shape for the head. Squares and rectangles are hard, strong, and rigid, which better fits the aloof cat we're looking for. But obviously, since it's still a cat, we just need to round those edges out to make sure it doesn't become a little too far for my liking. For the eyes, I turned the oval into almost 2 triangles, and that's because triangles are more sly and cunning. These are generalizations of the shape language, but they're useful guides when deciding how you want to push shapes to convey a certain feeling. And notice how for each feature that the shape almost loses all the roundness found in the first stylized cat, and the result is a lot more of a grumpy cat. As you can see, the triangles are sharper on the ears, the nose becomes a less bubbly T shape, and has a lot sharper edges. Oh, and you can see how I turned the cat's eyes into triangles. One part of that decision is that cats' eyes get really big when they're excited, which often makes them appear a lot cuter, but then when cats' eyes shrink, it usually means that they're calm or they face danger. So I'm sort of representing that, but also shape language like I was talking about earlier. Circles are soft and cute, while triangles are just more sly. Finally, I finished adding the fur details, still following the basic simple jagged lines here and there to indicate texture. Okay, with all 3 versions of the cat's face, hopefully you can now see how we changed the base shapes to stylize the cat from its realistic proportions to an overly cute round version, and then finally to a more grumpy, aloof cat. Well, with that out of the way, now that we know how to draw a cat, let's actually start coloring one. Okay, so we've basically already drawn the cat, or we've learned how to draw a cat, so I'm just going to zoom through these portions, but as you can see, I'm just drawing slightly off angle where the cat is slightly facing away from the camera. To do this, after drawing my circle, I put my guidelines curving around the face slightly off the center line. And also be sure to have the guidelines wrap around the face. One mistake I see is that the artist won't really draw the bend and just draw a straight line through the guidelines, which doesn't really help you follow the 3D perspective that a face might have when it's turning away. Remember, as the cat's head starts to turn away, you'll see less of the features on that side, or at least in this case, the angle of the shapes just start bending over towards that side. And of course, this is just stuff you'll learn as you keep drawing things in perspective, and as you draw more and more, you'll get better at learning how things move and how shapes bend. Another trick to learn to fix perspective errors is to flip your canvas so that you can spot your mistakes easier when you're drawing. And as you can see, I do it a lot because I'm just trying to get a better understanding of how to balance the cat's face. And then, as I said before, you can use the liquify tool to sort of just push the lines and shapes to where you want them to be. Before I start coloring, one thing I like to do is actually put like a sort of neutral grayish tone behind my actual sketch so that when I'm placing down the base colors and as I'm painting throughout the piece, I get a better understanding of the values and how dark and light things should be. When you're drawing on a white background, it really just skews your understanding of how lighting works, and it's kind of just a little terrifying looking at a blank white screen. So yeah, easy way to get rid of the white screen of doom. The first step to any painting is usually getting your base colors down. Again, I'm referencing an orange tabby cat, so as you can see I have the orange right there, and that's the entire base coat. Then I darken my tone and go a little browner for the initial patterns underneath the face. One thing I want y'all to keep in mind is that as I'm painting, I'm still thinking about large, medium, and small shapes. That way it's a lot easier for my brain to pick up what I actually need to be doing. If I try to attack all the complex details at once, you'll find it's really hard to focus on what you actually need to be doing. For example, for the ears, I drop in some pink and then I darken up that pink near the inside of the ears as like a secondary shape. And since this ear is soft and round, the color change is not as sharp but a somewhat smooth gradient. Now, it's not the smoothest gradient by any means, but it works with the type of style I'm painting in. It's when you have to paint realistically is where you have to make sure that every gradient is as smooth as it needs to be and every edge needs to be as sharp as it needs to be. The orange tabby cat also has like this gray beard, so I made sure to get that on early. At this early stage of rendering, I'm not really doing a lot of detailed brushwork. I'm still working on my large and medium shapes, and hopefully you can see that I'm not actually doing a ton of complex rendering. I'm just using the hard round brush and basically overlapping the base color of the fur with a secondary color and then selecting the mix of the colors with the color picker and then overlapping those brush strokes over and over again to create some bit of texture. I occasionally also use a smudge tool to soften up some of the bits because you always want a variety of hard and soft edges in your pieces. If you just have soft edges or hard edges, your piece will sort of look stale and not interesting. After I get the base pattern and the larger shapes down, I finally started moving towards smaller shapes. So the first thing was to get some white fur back into the mix. Underneath the cat's face, still doing the same thing as before, overlaying one color on the base and then coming back over with a new color, but this time with just smaller brush strokes. Next thing I want to talk about is notice how when I'm painting these darker patches on the face, my paint stroke direction follows the circular shape of the head. This is a small but pretty important thing and it makes your painting a lot more grounded. I mean, you can also just see it even here in the original base colors. My brush strokes follow the body of the cat. Here I'm just getting a little bit of color variation in where it belongs. So for example, underneath the mouth, I'm adding this like purplish grayish color, and then also on the eyes I'm adding a lot more oranges and brighter highlights for that added detail and pop. Then I finally start the small shapes and details. Now with the large and medium shapes down, I shrink my hard round even smaller and start adding my final shape adjustments and details. I also add some final fur details with a highlight to make those strains of fur really pop. I take a little break from that though because it seems I've forgotten to paint the nose, but it's really easy to paint, I promise. I start with the base color and add a highlight on the tip of the nose, and then add the shadows inside the nostrils. See? It's really that easy. Anyways, I resume adding the final details, and at this late stage, I'm adding all the small details like really small bits of fur, decreasing my brush size, and then just adding them throughout the piece. Honestly, I'm not really thinking too much about the location of my brush strokes, but I'm more just generally thinking about where they should be and how they should wrap around the face. I also use this time to add some final darkest darks and also add some final pops of bright orange. Finally, a couple of really cool details you should incorporate into your cat paintings are these little white hairs on the ears. Usually the hair near the ears are lighter and thinner, and that's why you draw them and you see them as white. Next up on the cool details is to lock the pixels on your sketch layer by selecting your layer and then selecting alpha lock. That way you can only draw on the pixels that have already been drawn on the layer. Anyways, what you want to do is select white and then go over the part of the cat's whiskers to show the effect of light passing through those areas. I feel like that final 5% of extra detail really ties a piece together, and I find this part to be like the most fun because it's really satisfying. Just adding those little extra bits of detail that overall doesn't really affect the piece, but really just sort of ties everything together. The last cool effect you can do is to create a layer above the sketch layer and draw little hairs that stick out past the silhouette of the cat. I draw some here on the cat ears, about the base of the neck, but then I take a step further by adding stray hairs that really just stand out from the form of the cat. This is all done to emulate randomness. In nature, almost nothing is ever perfectly symmetrical or follows form. Like the hair is very messy and you're gonna get some strands that just don't want to follow the rest of the hair. Anyways, with that, we basically have our final cat done. Congratulations! The very last thing to do is just to merge all my layers and then again just use the liquify tool to balance anything out that I might see differently now that the piece is finished. I made the cat's head a little smaller near the base of the neck and just pushed the face close together. With that said, hopefully you all enjoyed following along or just watching and learning some art. Now, as a digital artist, you also need to consider what tablet you might want to use to fulfill all your digital painting desires. If you liked the video and watched all the way to the end, make sure to subscribe to the XPPen channel to see more content like this, and see you on the next video!